So our next argument for the existence of God is a little more difficult to understand than the design argument. So for this argument, it goes like this. Let's just go through it first. God is the greatest being that can possibly be imagined. This comes out of, I guess, the beginning of our chapter when we talked about the attributes of God. One of them was perfection. And so this is one way that you could think about perfection. Number two, God exists as an idea in our minds. So in other words, we can conceive of the idea of God. We can think about God. We can imagine what God is. This is perhaps controversial, and we'll get to that later. A being that is actually real is greater than one that exists only in the mind. This is kind of seems obvious, but ends up being kind of strange, and again, we'll get to that in a little bit. So if God exists only in the mind, then we can conceive of one greater. Because there's one that's real, we could conceive of one that was real, that would be greater than the one that would exist only in our minds. But then going back to the beginning, we can't imagine anything greater than God, because God, again, by number one, is the greatest being that can possibly imagine. So then God must exist. Because, again, if God is the greatest being that can be imagined, and the greatest being that can be imagined must exist, then God must exist. So there's a lot going on here, but one of the things that it hinges on is this idea of existence as a property. Existence is not something we think of usually as a property. Like, properties are things like redness or bigness or, things like that. Properties that something might have. We don't really usually think of existence as a property, but I suppose we could, right? If we really think about it, maybe we can. So we can think about, well, does Queen Elizabeth II exist? Well, then you start to think about, well, what does existence mean? She used to exist. She doesn't exist anymore. Does existing count as a property? It's a strange property, right? Because it's not always clear. We can be pretty certain of what it means for something to be red, but can we be certain of what it means for something to exist? It seems a bit different and kind of odd. So if existence itself is a perfection, and we agree that God is perfect, then God must have all the imperfections. Well, what is a perfection? It's a strange idea that deists came up with. A long time ago, these Christian scholars came up with this idea. It probably goes back before that, but this idea of perfections, which is like some kind of property, but also properties that a perfect thing must have. So they count existence as something, a property, that a perfect thing must have. And this, again, is very strange. It's not really, you can tell it comes out of medieval scholarship because it doesn't really track the way we think about this stuff anymore. It's weird. But to kind of get a handle on it, we can go to these objections. So this is Galileo's objection, and he says, look, this is very old. This came out like right after Anselm made the first real, well, I don't want to say the first time because I'm sure it goes back before Anselm, but when Anselm formulated this argument, very soon after that, this objection was made. So if we place God with island, we seem to be able to conclude that the perfect island exists. So the perfect island he calls Pyland. So it's true by definition that Pyland is the greatest island that can possibly be imagined. So you can see how this goes to the exact same argument. Pyland exists and has an idea in our minds. An island that's actually real is greater than one that exists in the mind. So if Pyland exists in the mind, we can conceive of one greater. But by one, we can't imagine an island greater than Pyland, therefore Pyland exists. We don't really want this to go through, right? Because it's weird. The idea that there is such a thing as a perfect island is very strange. Now, Plato might have believed something like this, but he wouldn't think that the perfect island existed in the world, right? He wouldn't have said that existence is a perfection, because remember with the forms, they exist but in a different kind of way. They exist in this realm of the forms. Plato doesn't want the idea that the perfect island, let's say, or the perfect dog or whatever, actually is in the world in the same way as, an individual dog. So Plato wouldn't really subscribe to this, but this is somewhat perhaps where it comes from for Anselm. But so the idea that there must be a perfect island, if we can imagine such a thing, is not really the result that deists want. So there have been a lot of pretty powerful objections to this objection. Philosophers have pointed out that omnipotence, omniscience, and the other perfections or properties that Anselm wants to attribute to God, these perfections that we can talk about, are not really the same as the kind of perfections or properties that we might talk about an island having, and that they don't have sort of intrinsic upper limits. So what kind of properties does an island have? Well, let's say the island has trees. Well, is there a perfect number of trees for a perfect island to have? That's kind of weird, right? And that's perhaps weirder than saying that there's a perfect amount of omniscience that makes God the greatest, or a perfection of omniscience, which is also strange, but perhaps a little less strange. And that's part of that's where one of the objections comes from. So we can arguably, and again, you might not agree with this, and that's okay, but perhaps we can make sense of the idea of the perfections of God, that God has the greatest number of omnipotence and omniscience and so on, and that's what makes God perfect, and that God should also have the greatest, that God should also have existence in order to be perfect. We can kind of make sense of that. We can't with the island. There are lots of other objections to this idea, though, and one of them we kind of hinted at before is just that, do we really have an idea of God in our minds? Can we really conceive of a perfect being? And it's not clear that we can. Descartes thought we could, and Descartes was later than Anselm, but it's not clear that we really have a picture of what this means anyway. And so this could be a problem. But other philosophers have also said, well, it doesn't really rest on this argument doesn't really rest, the ontological argument doesn't really rest on us having a complete understanding of God, only sort of a general idea, but I'm not sure that gets Anselm where he wants to go. Anyway, some people think we can still argue for the existence of God based on our finite understanding of perfection, but it seems difficult. If we can't really process the idea of God, then to say that we can't imagine a greater being than God, well, we're not imagining God to begin with, so it seems problematic. There's lots of other objections to this argument as well, but this just gives you a little taste of the way that people have tried to argue against Anselm on this ontological argument.